Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the September 24th special meeting of Council. The City of Parksville recognizes the people of the Coast Salish Nations and their traditional territory upon which we gather with gratitude. I need a mover and a seconder for approval of tonight's agenda. Moved by Councillor Burton, seconded by Councillor Beale. Are there any errors or omissions? All those in favour? Opposed? Thank you. That is carried. First item on the agenda is the regulation of cannabis, and I need a mover and a seconder for the recommendation, which is to receive. Do I have a mover and a seconder? Moved by Councillor Patterson, seconded by Councillor Powell. Okay, Mrs. Kaler, we have two reports regarding the regulation of cannabis on the agenda tonight. The first report is provided for information only, as it was received by Council on June 18th. Mrs. Kaler, would you please introduce the second report?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So Council may recall in June, the initial report was presented outlining a number of options for Council to consider with respect to regulating recreational cannabis in the City of Parksville. During the summer, the provincial government released a regulation which also specifies the role of local governments in the referral process for provincial licensing. And the second report details some options for Council. We also have provided a cheat sheet, if you will, or a handout with a listing of the items that we're asking for Council direction on with respect to regulating cannabis. Essentially, to summarize for those in the audience and for Council, we're looking for some direction on where cannabis retail stores should be located. We're also looking for some direction on what the business license requirements should be. We're also looking for some direction on the fees for both the referral process with the provincial government and for business license fees for the City of Parksville. And we're also hoping that Council will consider developing a policy that will outline how and the process for Council's consideration of the referrals. We envision bringing some of these items back to Council in November and December, as is outlined on the schedule. And recommendations at this point are to receive and hopefully give us some specific direction to move that forward.
Thank you. First of all, I'm going to call the vote on the report to be received. We have a mover and a seconder. All those in favor of receiving the report? Thank you. That is done. So before we debate it as Council, I'm going to get some public input, and I'm going to ask for public input. Is that okay?
Yes, that is fine.
So is anyone in the audience wanting to provide comment to Council regarding the options for cannabis? And you can do so at this time by coming to the microphone and stating your name and civic address. Right up here. Just turn on the microphone and speak into the microphone, please. You can sit down, make yourself comfortable.
Okay. My name is Dave Dawes. I'm president of the Parksville Legion.
Your civic address, Mr. Dawes?
146 West Hurst Avenue. And now I'm supposed to? Okay. First of all, I guess the question is, if you think after my comments that there's anything relative that the Legion should know about in those two reports, could we get a copy of them? Okay. We have one concern and one concern only. We're not concerned about where it's sold or any of the commercial stuff. We have one issue only, and that is, as we understand the regulations now, it states that where cigarettes are smoked, you must also allow cannabis to be smoked.
We want to get a legal opinion. We have our lawyer in the audience tonight. Or Mrs. Kaler, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. At this point, that's not something that is within our jurisdiction at the municipal level. We understand that you are allowed by provincial law to smoke cannabis anywhere that you can smoke cigarettes or tobacco.
So that is at the very least your understanding as well, because that's what we were told by the liquor people today. We had a meeting at the Legion. if in effect that is the case, that actually makes it simple for us, or it's simpler for us to deal with. Then it's just a question of we allow both smoking and cannabis, or we allow no smoking whatsoever on Legion property. So that makes it simple for us, and really that's the only issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further members of the gallery want to provide input? Okay, so at this point in time, Council, you all have what Mrs. Kaler has referred to as a cheat sheet, and I'm going to go over them one by one to see what the majority of Council approves. So, yes, Councillor Oates.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just on the question that was asked just previously there by the President of the Legion, do we have the ability to thank you. Do we have the ability to put in any sort of regulation that would prevent the smoking of cannabis, or are we bound by the provincial laws on that? Can we further enhance that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Oates. I don't believe we have any jurisdiction there, but I would need to get some legal advice on how far we could go to be more prohibitive than the provincial regulations. I will certainly do that. What I heard from the Secretariat was that the reason why they allow smoking in the same places as tobacco smoking is because stratas will have the ability to prohibit smoking cannabis in their strata complexes. And for some folks who may rent in a strata or live in a strata, there's no other place other than where tobacco smoking is allowed now. There's no other place for people to consume what will be a legal product.
Councillor Burton and then Councillor Beale.
So the provincial regulation on cigarette smoking is a set distance away from a doorway and everything else goes.
Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Burden, there are some additional prohibitions in the bill for cannabis that state, for example, you cannot smoke in parks or schools or within certain distances of a bus shelter. I don't know the tobacco legislation as well, but I assume that it may apply in those cases also. But the concern, I guess, that we have at our level is the enforcement. I have asked the provincial folks what kind of enforcement.
It's my understanding from the things that I attended at UBCM that there's also a tie-in to the Liquor Act in terms of you can't walk down the street and smoke a joint. The same as you can't walk down the street and drink a beer.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Burden, I asked that specific question of the Secretariat in May. This is evolving, obviously, as you may have gotten some different information in September, but I was told that you can walk down the street consuming cannabis, but the laws for impairment will still apply, or the laws for being impaired in public and causing a disturbance. That's also confirmed in writing from the Secretariat to me, but again, that was in May and June of this year, so that may have changed.
Councillor Beale.
Thank you, Worship. And I have also attended sessions on this topic, and that is also my understanding, with the explanation, as you pointed out, that people who live in I think not only stratas, but it could be, correct me if I'm wrong, is it also possible that, apartment buildings, that could also be an issue there. So given that it is legal and if people cannot consume it in their home, that is why there is not the same restriction that we have with consuming alcohol. I want to pick up on the question that was asked by the gentleman regarding the Legion. Since the Legion is a privately owned facility, is it not possible for someone or an organization that owns a facility to decide the rules as to whether or not someone could be smoking or vaping cannabis? Would that not be the same kind of a situation, since it's not actually a public space, it's a private space?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Beale, I don't know the answer to that. We would have to get some legal opinions on whether a private individual is obligated to allow that kind of a use, or whether they, I would hope that they would have the ability to make that decision for themselves. But when it comes to zoning, I guess the city would be looking at whether or not to prevent, say, for example, restaurant use from allowing smoking. My understanding at the moment is that WorkSafe requires that there's all these rules around the tobacco smoking, but I don't know enough on the legal obligation side of it, whether they would have to permit somebody who can, if you can smoke cigarettes, I don't know if you have to permit cannabis as well. I'd have to find out.
Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Your Worship. In the past, we've had Dr. Hasselbeck here before Council and had talked a little bit about smoking and on our city streets and other areas. And I realized that we're looking at some of the cannabis regulations and that they wouldn't be around schools and everything. But could we tie it into a bylaw and that of not having cannabis smoking on city streets and sidewalks and that as well?
Mrs. Keeler, we need to get some provincial
Again, I'm
direction on
assuming
that.
that's legal.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Patterson. We could potentially have a bylaw. I'd have to check and see if we're delegated that authority. The issue I think that would come up for us, and we have had these discussions around the smoking of tobacco, is the ability to enforce. It's very difficult if somebody is smoking even in the park, say by the playground. By the time we get the complaint and the bylaw officer is able to respond, the person's not there anymore. So we did talk at one point about signage and voluntary, like voluntary adherence to that. But I will certainly follow up with the province and see if we're allowed to prohibit it in public streets. I'm not sure if we can at this point.
Councillor Beale.
Thank you very much. Picking up on Councillor Patterson's comments, I do understand that given the restrictions, again, particularly as they apply to people who live in apartments or stratas, et cetera, that you know, and you're not going to have smoking in places due to WorkSafe regulations, so it won't be in restaurants, and you don't want to be consuming and then driving. That you know, there does need to be a little bit of leeway. But going back to the limitations on tobacco smoke and understanding the dangers associated with secondhand smoke, I must say I would really love to see us expand those areas to include bus stops. I'm pleased to hear that it does apply to bus shelters, because my understanding was that that was something at the municipal level and not absolutely included at the provincial level. And also I'm encouraged to hear, if I understand correctly, that there will be some thought given to signage, because signage, I do think, really helps. It helps with education, and it also makes it easier for a bystander to point out a sign and say, hey buddy, maybe you didn't see the sign, but this area is actually a no smoking and no vaping area. Would you mind just moving down a little bit? So I don't like to think that anybody's waiting at a bus stop and forced to be taking in the smoke, and just that modeling of vaping for our young people or elderly or whatever age. Thank you. And I really will stop.
Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I think it's important that we have this discussion, but it's also a little premature because we don't know what this is going to look like. People may not be smoking as much as they may be using edibles, and that being the case, there won't be any odor. So at some point, edibles will be on the market. Well, they are on the market actually now for medical. But anyway, I just would like to finish. So that's one thing. And then the other being that, if we liken this to cigarette smoking, many people who smoke cigarettes are quite respectful of folks who don't. And so they're not walking down the street smoking cigarettes. There are people who do, we know that because we pick up the butt. But for the most part, we don't have a lot of that. So hopefully, maybe those are the same people that will be smoking cannabis and may have that same respect for others. So that would be my hope. And I think if not, that would be when we would need to stop and take a look at, well, this is what's specifically happening in our community, and so how do we address that, rather than try and do it all up front and not even need to have done it. Going forward, I just wanted to ask about or discuss the things like questions where do you think it should be grown, like whether it should be agricultural or industrial or whatever. So I'd like to put my 2 cents in there. And I would like to see it in industrial and agricultural, but not using up good farmland, right? Because for the most part, they shouldn't be using soil for cannabis if you're growing it for sale because of the bugs and so on that get into the plant. So for the most part, those are going to be done in greenhouses, and you don't want to see a greenhouse on top of really good farmland. So that's my thinking on that piece, and as well as where should it be sold, where should the retail be, and for me it would be liquor stores.
Thank you. Okay, I think that the name of the game is we're certainly going to walk before we run with regards to this. This is going to be a new experience, and time will tell, as they say, in terms of what has to be adjusted and what has to be changed. I'd like to, okay, sorry, Councillor Oates, I was going to move on, but go ahead.
What we're discussing tonight is a regime for the regulation of retail cannabis, just not growing it or anything like that, right?
It's table three in the report.
Retail.
Yeah. That's what I'd like to deal with now, if council will allow me. You've got your cheat sheets. And number one is that bylaw amendments will come into force on January 31st, 2019, and staff made it quite clear as to why that's an acceptable date for them. Legally it becomes October 17th, but again, as I said, we need to walk before we run. So all of those, I need a mover and a seconder for the bylaw amendment coming into force on January 31st. Okay, I have Councillors Powell and Councillor Beal. Discussion. Councillor Salter.
Are we sure that we can do that legally when the feds have indicated that it's
yes, we are.
Can? Okay.
Yeah. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Will this be able to come back and forth to Council a couple times? I'm kind of wondering about the timeline to have the bylaw amendments in place on that. So
I see Mrs. Keeler saying yes. You want to talk to that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Patterson, we have a proposed date, but the council of the day can take longer if it wishes to review things. But we are hoping that while we're also working on the election, we can be preparing the bylaws to come forward in November and December, and we would be bringing accompanying policy as well for council to discuss. And if they're not ready, we can certainly move it back. January 31st doesn't have to be the date if council's not ready. We're just hoping it's not before then.
Councillor Oates?
Have we received any applications from anybody looking for the city's letter of approval? Because I understand that that's one of the changes that's happened. The city now has to issue a letter of, for want of a better word, a letter of approval. Have we received any applications in that regard?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Oates, we actually received 3 in the last 5 days. They have all been advised. The provincial government sends them to us, and we have been advising the province that as of today, or the day, that there is no zoning approval or process. So they've been basically, we don't accept the referral at this point.
Okay, so can I have a mover and a seconder. Bylaw amendments will come into force on January 31st, 2019. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. That is carried. Okay. The next one is a little more We've already discussed that with Councillor Salter's comments. Cannabis retail stores are permitted in all zones where retail trade is permitted or permitted in the following zones. Let's say I need a mover and a seconder. Are you voting for the permitted in all zones where retail trade is permitted? Moving it? Okay. Thank you. Any discussion on that? Councillor Burton.
So the survey that went out to the public is fairly clear, that people believe that significantly anywhere retail sales are occurring, that we should allow. Now, I believe there's also a section where we have the ability to have some setbacks in terms of schools and liquor outlets.
Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Burden, Council can put setbacks to a number of different things. We provided some examples. We provided some examples from what other jurisdictions are doing in terms of setbacks, but we could really do anything that Council would like to see if they think there's a sensitive use. It doesn't have to be restricted to what we've listed.
Okay, Councillor Salter and then Councillor Beal.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So for me, it's two things. Once again, I think a liquor store is a good place to provide this item simply because it is very closely connected to alcohol. It can impact your, ability, blah, blah, blah. That's number one. And they've been doing this for so long. The other is if it is in anywhere, then if like cigarette sales, they're kept behind like a curtain. So it's not like you can go in the store and just see it on display, or it's there, in the candy counter. It's actually not visually available, so that at least folks who are underage wouldn't maybe see it. That would be my recommendation, is that it's not displayed any more than cigarettes are.
Councillor Beal.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify that the provincial government is not permitting the sale of cannabis in liquor stores. They will be, they've basically expanded the branch that manages liquor stores to also regulate cannabis, and they will be standalone stores. Some will be privately owned, like liquor stores are, and others will be run by the provincial government. But for recreational cannabis, they're not allowing them to be sold with alcohol. There are some differences for medical, like for the prescribed cannabis. I believe drugstores have been given some approvals for that, but for the recreational cannabis sales, they're standalone retail stores.
Councillor Beal.
Thank you, Your Worship. And again, having attended some sessions on that, I do understand that there may be some slight differences in rural areas or rural or remote areas, but that certainly doesn't apply to Parksville. I just wanted to clarify something. What we're looking at is the second note here. Regarding cannabis retail stores permitted in zones where retail trade. Now, Councillor Burden asked the question about particular conditions that we would want to attach. So if we were to go ahead and agree to this, that does not negate, will we be coming to those individual notes down below separately? Because I'm worried that that might be a little bit where the confusion is.
Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Beal, we would regulate the setbacks through the business licensing bylaw. So essentially what we would ask Council for is a decision on the zone where it would be permitted, but then the business license bylaw would regulate the setbacks, the hours of operation, those kinds of things.
Okay, Councillor Burton.
Can we include a form and character piece within the I'd like nice-looking facilities that aren't behind bars and gates and doors and have the windows blacked out. And, I don't think we want to have an addition to our community that is not inviting without being too inviting.
Like Ben and Jerry's.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Burden. Depending on the zoning, most of the stores will have a form and character development permit area for facade changes. However, there are some exemptions from the development permit requirements if, for example, it's below a certain renovation cost, or if they're not changing the exterior of the building. I will get some legal advice on whether or not we can establish form and character guidelines through business licensing. My understanding at the moment is that we'd have to do it through a DP, a development permit. So we would need to amend the OCP to do that. But I will certainly look into a way that legally we can put in some guidelines or criteria, perhaps through the business license bylaw. I just have to double check on how we can do that.
Follow up?
Yes, so I note that there's a requirement for some kind of a security plan as well. So those have to work together.
Okay, can I call the vote on cannabis retail stores are permitted in all zones where retail trade is permitted? All those, we have a mover and a seconder. All those in favor? Okay, we're moving on. Thank you. The next one is cannabis growing, processing, and packaging for any use other than personal use is permitted in the agricultural and industrial zones. Mover and a seconder for that. By Councillor Beale, seconded by Councillor Powell. Discussion. Councillor Burden.
We had a company come to us a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, looking to put a facility in the industrial park, right? Do we have those, do we have that zoning from that instance? I know that there was some work done. Is that?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Burden. The way our wording, our zoning bylaw is currently worded, it actually expressly prohibits agricultural growing. So we do allow medical marijuana in the industrial and agricultural zones. So if council would like us to follow that, we would amend the zoning bylaw to allow cannabis growing in the industrial and like commercial cannabis growing in the industrial and agriculture zones also.
Follow up.
So I just heard all sorts of arguments over the weekend with regard to the use of agricultural land. What I gleaned from that was that it's probably not a good idea because of we'd rather see food grown on agricultural land. And so if we could restrict it to industrial land, in my opinion. Yeah, that's a motion.
Okay, Councillor Salter.
Well, I'm seconding his motion. Yeah.
Okay, so we're ready to call the vote. Any further questions? Councillor Beale?
I'm just wondering if Councillor Burden would like to just make an amendment to this motion. Okay. Do you want to make an amendment to strike
It's number 3 on your sheet.
What?
agricultural? So, for instance, one could eliminate agricultural and then leave it as industrial zones.
Yeah, if we could strike the word agricultural.
We need a motion for that, to strike the word agricultural, no? You're just making an amendment for an amendment. Okay. So we're taking out agricultural land and sticking with industrial zones. We need to vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment? Opposed? Now we'll vote on the entire motion. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. Okay. Well, this should be a fairly quick one. Cannabis activities are not permitted as a home-based business. I need a mover and a seconder.
That's a really broad blanket statement, and I don't know that we want to make that broad of a blanket statement. What if somebody wanted to run some kind of a mail order system out of their home, or if they wanted to deal with a cannabis product that possibly doesn't contain THC out of their home? I think there's lots of, I don't think it's a gimme.
Okay, Councillor, Mrs. Kaler is going to make a comment. I think that's a provincial regulation, is it not? Or?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The discussion that we had about this in our task force group was that it's not necessarily a prohibition forever, but at the moment edibles are not currently permitted, which we thought were more suited to a home-based business type of activity. We don't allow that kind of use for liquor, for example. We don't allow people to make wine at home and then sell it or deliver it. There are probably a lot of health-related things that the province hasn't come forward with yet in terms of, food safe or a particular kitchen or bathroom facilities that apply for those kinds of uses. And we also just felt that at this time, we wouldn't have the enforcement ability. So we discussed that we would hope at first it wouldn't be permitted, but that's not to say that a year from now or a couple of years from now it would be opened up to allow for it.
Councillor Burton.
So how do we enforce that?
Through complaints. So basically what would happen is if somebody was selling and people were noticing, traffic or saw that they were doing it, then we would investigate, and we would be working with the provincial authorities and also perhaps the RCMP, depending on where that product was coming from. We at this point just felt like it would be very difficult for us to manage if we were to regulate it and permit it, but that's up to council to provide some additional direction on that.
Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I actually agree with that. Again, I think it's a bit premature, but at this point, we don't have much of an option for how it is right now. The other piece to that for me is selling out of your home doesn't make a lot of sense. I think that was part of the reason that we ended up making cannabis legal, was to stop that home-based business and the safety issues that surround that particular type of business. So by moving it into retail and commercial areas, you don't have the same personalities that you would have if you were growing it in your own home and then selling it out of your own home, and the safety and all of that.
On that note, I'm going to call the vote. Those are pretty succinct comments. Councillor Burton.
There's a number of products that don't have THC in them, but they're cannabis-related products. There are pet products that don't have THC in them, but they're cannabis-related products. And I think making a broad statement like that could prevent somebody from getting into a viable business that isn't a threat to the community.
Why wouldn't we wait and see how this thing evolves if people start coming forward with that?
I'm good with that. I just want to make sure that we're not just...
Okay. I'm going to call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. That is carried. Okay, this is I'm going to read this very slowly. This is number 5, and there's an A and B to it. All cannabis businesses are required to have a valid business license and adhere to special provisions pertaining to annual criminal record checks for owners, operators, and all employees, and restricted hours of operation from whatever we want in the AM to the PM daily. So, discussion. You want to move the recommendations? Moved by Councillor Patterson, seconded by Councillor Beale. Discussion. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Your Worship. I guess I'd kind of like to poll council on the time frame. I really wouldn't want to see business operations after, say, 9 o'clock, which is kind of
okay. Let's go around the table. So. Councillor Oates, what do you feel about that?
9 p.m., 8 p.m. I'm fine. Whatever the business world dictates it should be. Whenever, however long. I don't think there's a lot of businesses open downtown much after 9 p.m. So 9 p.m. is good for me.
Councillor Powell.
I think the same times as the liquor stores.
Councillor Beale.
Yes, I noticed that a number of the comments in there suggested the same time as the liquor stores. Just a question though, are any open later than 10 p.m.? I think they might be open till 10, but are they till 11? Ooh, that's getting late. I would rather 10 as a cutoff, but yeah, some go till 11. I guess there again, it depends where they are, but they are going to be in retail zones, so I'm easy there, but I would suggest 10.
Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This isn't big for me. I don't know what time they should come and go at. I don't care. I think it's going to be up to the owner of the business to decide what time they want to pay someone to stand there and sell this for. So just like they do with anything else, cigarettes, groceries, whatever it is that you're buying, whatever that business owner wants to pay for, then they can pay for it. That's not an issue for me. I do have trouble with the criminal record check. And that's just because, you know, if you have a clothing store, you don't need a criminal record check every year. You don't need a yearly criminal record check to sell liquor. Like, I'm not quite sure why owners need to have a criminal record check if this is illegal. That doesn't make sense to me. It might in the future, but at this point, it seems onerous to me because you're assuming that there will be a criminal record after a year, and I'm not sure about that, you know. Restaurants, you don't need a criminal record check when you're selling food, whatever. I just don't, that doesn't make sense to me. I can't support that.
The other issue is that they've got a criminal record check because they were producing illegally marijuana, and now it's legal. What does that mean? Councillor Burden.
It's kind of scary, but I agree with Councillor Salter.
Okay, Mrs. Kaler, do you want to make a comment at this point in time?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would just like to point out that council does not have to put any of these conditions in place. We are just seeking some direction as to how many additional conditions council may want. I can certainly provide an explanation as to why we put these ones in if any of the councillors wish, but if we do have conditions for a number of businesses in Parksville, things like banks, escort services, other unusual activities, but they're not extremely onerous. In other communities, they're the opposite. They have a lot of different conditions. So it's really open for council's direction and discussion at this point. We don't really know what's the best option either, and anything that we do put in place can also be reviewed in the future.
I like the similarity with liquor stores. I think Councillor Oates, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm with respect to the criminal record checks, you know, I don't like to differentiate between the type of businesses there, but I think that this is so new and this is so, there's a lot of unknowns to the general public out there. I think that, you know, I think that we as a council would make the public a little more comfortable if we did require something like that. And, you know, if after a couple of years it becomes, you know, passé kind of thing, you can remove it. But I think it would derive a certain level of comfort to the people knowing that these businesses are operating as all on the up and up, and it's similar to what Councillor Burden was saying earlier about forming character. You have the nice boutique type business and that. And it's just one more thing that you could do to reassure people with the concern of crime and everything in this town. I think that that's a small thing. It's restrictive for the businesses, I understand, but I think it's more important to make the people comfortable, and so I would support it.
Okay, Councillor Salter and then Councillor Beal.
Oh, so I'm just wondering if anyone in council's ever heard of a place called Wall Street? Because if you're looking for criminals, that's where they are. So first of all, I'm going to say this. We're assuming that folks that are going to be managing a business or be selling cannabis, this is assuming that there will be criminals at some point. If there is a criminal record, if they get a record for whatever they're doing in their business, the police are going to know that. They're going to deal with the charges, and it becomes public knowledge when there is a criminal record. So I find this to be very invasive. And there's a huge assumption. I think if it becomes an issue, then we might want to look at criminal record checks, but it's not. At this point, there's an assumption of guilt, and there isn't any. We're not there. So I don't think that's right.
Councillor Salter. Councillor Beal.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't necessarily assume that that means that there's an assumption of that, but I tend to agree with Councillor Oates, but I would very much like to hear from Mrs. Kaler a bit more about the background. But before that, even, I'd like to mention that, you know, I don't know who would be following up with these police record, police information checks, I think they're called now, but anyway. And also having something on record in many cases did not necessarily preclude employment. It might depend on what the charge was, et cetera. At least that's been my experience in organizations that I've been part of. But I'd love to know more about where this came from and the thinking behind it.
I think in staffing anywhere now, I think they do a criminal record check, don't they? Mrs. Keeler, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in the task force that we set up, it included members of the Oceanside RCMP, and this was a specific comment from them that it would be extremely helpful, similar to what Councillor Oates was saying at the beginning of legalization, to deter those who are perhaps not a bona fide business but might be using that business as a money laundering or something related to organized crime, where they can now kind of have this front of a legal store. The other thing that was mentioned was the comfort level for the community when it's a new industry, and there have historically been those criminal ties through organized crime, which is part of the reason why I believe the senior governments are trying to legalize this. So again, we did discuss that perhaps up front it might be something that makes sense, but a year or 2 years or 3 years from now, maybe it doesn't. But again, this is new for all of us, and so we felt it was easier to put some more restrictive things in place at first, and if they don't make sense, we can then, through council direction, take them off. But that was kind of the reasoning.
Councillor Burton.
So I think I could go along with a criminal record check if it was for information rather than a reason to deny. Well, there are a number of criminal offenses that have nothing to do with the sale of marijuana.
Councillor Beale, I think if you've got a criminal record...
No, I partially agree with Councillor Burton. However, aggravated assault, armed robbery. I mean, there may be other activities that might not seem to be a good fit. However, there are things that one might be charged with that really are not going to have a negative bearing on the, doing the business. So I would like to support this motion.
Okay, what I'm going to do is, we don't want to be debating this forever. I'm going to call just a vote on, I need a mover and a seconder for A, annual criminal record checks for owners, operators, and all employees. So I have a mover and a seconder for that. Moved by Councillor Powell, seconded by Councillor Beale. All those in favor? Opposed? Okay, that's carried. So the next one is restricted hours of operation. And what I'm hearing around the table, if it's good enough for the liquor stores, should be good enough for the cannabis stores. Go ahead.
So when we say, we need to define it, because if we're talking, is it 11 o'clock we're talking about? I don't know if I'm comfortable with 11 o'clock. If that's what, I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with 11 o'clock. I think that...
What would council be comfortable with? What hour?
I move 9 a.m. to 9 p.m.
Do I have a seconder for that? Seconded by Councillor Patterson. Discussion, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Councillor...
Why don't we make it the same as the liquor stores and let people decide what their business is going to look like? I have no idea what time people like to smoke marijuana or buy it. Maybe we get some more activity in the streets of our community. Maybe coffee shops will stay open later.
Okay, so we've got 2 points of view, and we'll go for. Did I call for a mover and a seconder?
Yes, you did on this.
9 a.m. to 9 p.m. All those in favor?
No.
No?
Point of order. There's a motion on the floor about liquor stores. We have to deal with that.
Oh, okay. So those we have a mover and a seconder for liquor stores, which is 9 a.m. to 11 p.m.
What the liquor store hours, whatever they are. I don't.
It's 11 p.m., right?
I think they open later.
Okay, so all of those in favor of 9 a.m. to 11 p.m.
The hours of liquor stores. That's the clarity. There's not. Yeah, you're making up times.
All right, so it's a 9 a.m. to 11
No, the same hours as liquor stores.
Same hours as liquor stores, but they vary. Some,
Well,
Is there a motion on the floor?
yes,
yeah.
And what does that motion say?
the same as liquor stores.
No.
Same as liquor stores, okay. That's the motion, same as liquor stores. Okay. All in favor? Opposed? That carries. Same as liquor stores. Thank you.
I feel like we're sweetie.
Okay. The other item is, which I want to deal with separately, number C, is the submission of a security plan prepared by a suitably qualified professional. Second, do I have a seconder for that? I have a mover and a seconder by Councillor Burden.
And I'd like to-
Discussion.
So tell me what a suitably qualified person is.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Burden. This one was taken from Victoria and Vancouver, and what they have are folks who are, a lot of them are ex-law enforcement or folks who work in the security business, and they basically, the plans that I saw as examples, they address things like workers working in tandem after certain hours, lighting over doors, secure vaults for the product or for cash, those types of things. And they essentially put it together in a plan for the business so that everybody understands the risks. Or
Follow up.
So can we have some sort of wording that defines what that individual is? It just leaves it way too open.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Burden, what we envision is coming back to council with forms and sample, like, so for someone who's applying for a business license, we would have kind of a sample of the expectations for any requirements. So it would lay out what that should contain and what kind of background the person preparing it should have.
One more follow-up.
Well, I've been up since some ungodly hour in Ontario. Who's going to approve the security plan?
Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Burden, it would be the license inspector when they apply for business license. That is, at the moment, any of our senior bylaw compliance officer is the license inspector, but any of the bylaw officers are license inspectors for regular. We would probably delegate that to the senior gentleman.
Okay, I have Councillor Powell, Councillor Oates, and Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Worship. So if the licensing inspector is going to approve their security plan, why isn't it one of their requirements? Oh, your licensing, our licensing.
Yes, our.
Okay, and so, you know, just to clarify, you said, because I didn't attend the UBCM and I wasn't lucky enough to go to the cannabis workshop, and so, were they giving out samples? No, that's funny though. Anyways, and so, you said earlier they're only allowed to sell it in stores, retail stores. So somebody like Tim Hortons couldn't sell cannabis.
Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Powell, what we've been told by the provincial control branch is that they will only be issuing licenses to a standalone store. They have indicated that similar to the liquor store model, there's private and public, but they essentially, like, you don't see a liquor store selling scarves or other items, so they want them to be standalone stores. They will issue a provincial license that has the conditions for, you know, whatever the province wants to enforce, and then we would issue a municipal business license.
Councillor Oates.
Do we require any other businesses to have a security plan in place and proof of that?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, yeah, I believe I'd have to double check, but I know we have a different fee for banks, partly based on the security elements, but I couldn't say that we require a specific plan. I think there would be hesitation on the part of the bank to tell us their security plan.
Just a comment. I don't know that I could support that seems to be pretty onerous. If they, if they want to protect their stock, they'll have some sort of security plan. Why we're concerned about that, I'm not sure. I moved it for discussion, but I don't think I'm going to be able to support it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and that actually was my question, was if there is any other business in town that has to provide a security plan, and being that there isn't one, I wouldn't support this either, because again, I think it's invasive.
Okay, so I'm going to call the vote. Oh, I'm sorry, do you have something to add? Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Again, I'm just, my mind's kind of going like, it's okay, why would a business not want to have a really solid security plan that was putting this together? And again, I want to ask the question, where did this come from? I mean, is there any sort of nefarious thought behind this that, that they could be set up for some connection again with black market or something else?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Beale. This was, what we did as part of our task force was review what is being done in other places. And this was a common requirement in some of the American cities that have legalized cannabis. And it was also a requirement for Victoria and Vancouver. I think when we discussed it in our group, there was some support for it in terms of a deterrent. If this is an attractant for folks who might want to break in and steal the product. We don't require it for liquor stores, and so what we tried to do in our discussions was always think, do we do that for liquor stores or not? But liquor stores do sometimes obviously do their own, but it was just something that we wanted to present to council because it did appear to be in quite a few of the other places that we saw as examples.
Okay, I think we've discussed this long enough. So, submission of a security plan prepared by a suitably qualified professional. All those in favor? Opposed? That is defeated.
I'll move submission of the voter control plan.
Prepared by a suitably qualified professional? Do I have a seconder for that? Okay. Now this can be pretty smelly. So, Councillor Burton.
Do we require one for coffee roasters?
Apparently, the smell of marijuana can be pretty nasty. I love the smell of coffee. Councillor Beale.
Thank you. I would just like to clarify: are we discussing just cannabis retail in this particular item? In which case, and people are not consuming it on the premises, correct? Or are we not getting, because if it's just there and people are coming in and purchasing it, I don't think there would be very much odor at that point.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, thank you. Through you to Councillor Beale, this would be for any cannabis business requiring a business license. So it would be for producers, for retail stores. We have had experience with an illegal or unauthorized dispensary in town, and we did receive complaints from the neighbors about the smell, especially, I guess, during shipping or bringing the product in. There are, similar to agricultural industries, there are specialists who design systems, I'm not an engineer, but scrubbers, they call them, on intakes so that the odor is controlled. And so, again, in other jurisdictions, they have required that as a way to reduce conflict with neighbors where they're closely together. It's definitely up for council to decide in this case.
Councillor Salter.
I just want to say, I know that staff have worked really hard on this, really thought about what they're putting down, but I really feel like I am at the genesis of what it must have been like when Prohibition ended. That's how I feel we are sitting here, because liquor was such a bad thing back then, and how much further we've come, where we've ended up with it. And so that's how I feel about what we're doing right now. I think this is just there is a lot of concern and distress and so on, but I suspect in many years it'll be historical or hysterical. I'm not sure which.
Okay, I'm going to call the vote. Those who approve of an odor control plan prepared by a suitably qualified professional. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Thank you. Now, do I have a seconder for that? Submission of a good, seconded by Councillor Powell. Any discussion?
It's too late. They've had to comply with so many things, they don't want to be in the neighborhood.
No discussion, I'm going to call the vote. All those in favor? Thank you, that's carried. Separation distances of at least 200 meters or alternative distance from a commercial daycare center, senior center, seniors care facility, rehabilitation, or drug treatment center. I need a mover and a seconder. 200 meters. No mover, no seconder? Moved by Councillor Burton, seconded by Councillor Beale. Discussion. Councillor Beale.
Thank you. I just had, I've spoken with Mrs. Kaler about this earlier and also with some other service providers in town, but I have some concerns about the use of the word rehabilitation in there. I just think that rehabilitation might mean physio, might mean other things, and also just with current terminology that tends to be used. I'm thinking about the fact that in government, provincial government, we now have a minister of mental health and addiction. So I would like to, if I could do this as an amendment, I would like to, in place of the term rehabilitation or drug treatment center, I would like to substitute that with mental health and or addiction services.
Everybody okay with that?
No.
Oh, hold on. You made an amendment.
Yeah.
The amendment's been seconded. Discussion on the amendment. Councillor Salter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I see nothing wrong with what's here right now. It says drug treatment center, which I find is far less stigmatizing than addiction. And as long as we keep using the word addiction, we continue to stigmatize. It's not an addiction. It's a health issue. It's just a health issue. So I don't like that word addiction. It's as bad as using the word indigent, and I don't like that either. So I just think we have to stop doing that. There's nothing wrong with what's here. We understand it. It was fairly clear. I don't think anyone here didn't know what this meant. And if they don't, it can be explained to them pretty simply. So I don't see a need to do that.
Okay, I'm on the amendment. We have an amendment proposed by you. Do you want to speak to the amendment again? Go ahead.
I must say that more than the drug comment, my concern was that with the term rehabilitation, that perhaps that would not include organizations that provide services for people with mental health issues. And I know that I have been approached by some service providers who would be concerned that having a cannabis retail outlet right beside a mental health services center would not be a good fit. So at the same time, if it's voted down and if rehabilitation is defined to include that sort of thing, then I won't be too upset.
Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Worship. I support this motion, the amendment, because I think when you talk about mental health and addictions, you're talking about a service that's available in our community through the provincial government. And I think that's what identifies it. And I agree with Councillor Salter that it is a stigma against people who have an addiction, but right now we don't have another name that the provincial government's using, so I'll support it.
Councillor Salter and then Councillor Oates.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I find this really interesting. I really do. And I'll tell you why. Because this council has all agreed to a support, well, most of them have agreed to a supportive housing building here. And in supportive housing, you can use your drugs, and that's okay. And there could be somebody in there who's just gotten out of treatment, but they can come back now. And while they're there, their friend down in 301 can use their drugs. So I'm not quite sure how it is that this is a problem, that there's drugs near a treatment center or near a rehab center, when in fact we will actually have our own building where drugs will be allowed whenever, like people can use them in their rooms. So I'm not getting that why suddenly we have a problem with the word rehab. It makes no sense to me. This is almost seems to be argumentative.
Councillor Oates.
Who would be excluded by the change in the wording? Would anybody be excluded by the change in the wording? Or does it capture more people than the additional wording, or is this just really an argument over nomenclature, which I really don't have a lot of appetite for?
Mrs. Kaler, and then I'm going to call the vote.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Oates, what we would do is put together a definition for the actual bylaw, and we could include the intent that council is discussing. I think when we were putting it in place, we were not considering, a physical rehabilitation like a physio. We were thinking of drug and treatment and rehab centers. But we can certainly, when we are crafting the bylaw, if council wants us to put in a distance, we will come up with a definition that we think captures what's being discussed and present it to council.
Okay, I'm going to call the vote on. No, I'm going to call the vote on the amendment. We've discussed it long enough. All of those in favor of the amendment? Opposed? That is defeated. I'm going to come back to the original amendment, which is written, which I read out a while ago. I have a mover and a seconder for that, don't I? Yes, Councillor Oates and then Councillor Salter. All those in favor? Well, it's the separation distances of at least 200 meters or alternate distance from a commercial daycare center. Seen?
We just discussed the amendment, Mark.
Yeah.
Now we discussed.
Yeah, I'm back to this. I'm back to the original motion. That's
the main motion.
Yeah, that's the main motion. Do you want to speak to the? Oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. What is our separation distance now for where tobacco is sold, and that same question, liquor?
Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Oates, we do not have one. There is no separation distance in our bylaw for that.
So, how did we come up with the 200 meters? Is that common with other jurisdictions? Like, I don't know whether 200 meters is appropriate, or should it be 100 meters, 50 meters. 200 meters is a pretty long distance.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Oates, it was kind of the middle road. What we saw was 150 to 300. 300 was more common in the American cities, and the cities in Canada that had either put something out as a proposal or currently allow for things, which isn't that many, they were mostly 150. So it ranged, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to call the vote on this motion, which is item number F. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. That is carried. All right. The last, not the last one, but the third from last, the submission of a light pollution plan for hydroponic or commercial greenhouse facilities. Anybody who's ever seen a hydroponic operation for vegetables is like a Star Wars. Moved by Councillor Salter, seconded by Councillor Patterson. Discussion. Councillor Patterson.
Okay,
Salter,
that's me.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I absolutely support this and would be interested in seeing, once you dig into it, I would like to see the detail, because I do know that this has caused so much distress for folks who know that such a facility is going up near them. Over on the mainland, it doesn't have to be cannabis. You're right. It's anything that's being grown in a greenhouse. Over on the mainland, it's like looking out over a small city when you're living in the country. So, yeah, it's big.
Okay. No other comments. I'm going to call the vote. Submission of a light pollution plan for hydroponic or commercial greenhouse facilities. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. That is carried. Now, the next two items, Mrs. Kaler, you're going to have to give us some advice on this. All cannabis businesses will be subject to a business license fee of, what is that looking like? Oh, I want to, let's look at numbers first, and then we can see.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is another one that is a very large range. The provincial license application fee is going to be $7,500. We saw examples of a huge variation. Victoria, for example, requires all cannabis operations to go through a rezoning first, site-specific. They charge about $7,500 for the rezoning. Then they will be charging $5,000 for their license fees. Vancouver is charging over $30,000 for theirs right now, which I think they're in court to defend those costs. A lot of the cities across Canada that we came across, Manitoba, I think, was, or Saskatoon, I believe, was $5,000. That seems to be a common. The highest license fee that we have in the city of Parksville is $2,000. Our medical marijuana license fee is currently $500. And I would maybe just mention to council that the fee for a business license should be commensurate with the amount of effort and resources we have to put into administering that. So my recommendation would be that we consider something in line with the current schedule that we have, which is between $500 and $2,000. The more conditions that we have in the business license process, we can then justify a higher fee. The fee is also, I think, justified when there's a strain on the resources. So, for example, with banks, why we charge a higher business license fee is that there are additional security measures that maybe police, who the city pays for, would have to deal with, or we get heightened complaints around folks hanging around a bank. So I think when council is considering the fee, they should be mindful of how much we're actually, administering or spending to do the business license, and what is a reasonable fee for operating a business within the city.
Councillor Burden, and then Councillor Patterson.
Your Worship, can we have a motion on the floor before we continue discussion?
I just have a quick question before we put a motion forward. What do we charge liquor stores?
$150.
Patterson, what was your? You want to what?
Move the motion so we can discuss the proper procedures.
But this is about dollars.
Well, I'll move that we set a license fee of $150.
Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Salter, okay. So discussion on the $150. Councillor Beal.
Which business would I have to be in to be charged $2,000 for a business license? How do you know that? Okay. Anyway, just.
You're going to make me reiterate. Yes, so the examples are banks do pay a higher fee of $2,000, and escort services in Parksville also have that. A number of resort hotels do pay a higher license because they pay per room also. But sort of a standalone license is just those more unique.
Follow up, Councillor Oates.
Yeah, I don't think we need to go to 2,000, but I think it needs to be a fair bit more than 150, given the resources that the city is going to have to put into it, at least for the initial stages of it. So I'm hoping we defeat the 150 and we look at a number somewhere around 1,000.
Further discussion. I'm going to call the vote on the 150.
The suggestion was that I make the amendment from 150 to 1,000.
Do I have a seconder for that? Seconded by Councillor Salter. Discussion on the amendment. Seeing none. I have a.
I just want to clarify, banks are 500, right?
Don't get me talking about banks. Not tonight. Okay. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you, Your Worship. The amount of regulation and the amount of staff, I'd like to see it at the highest amount possible at this point in time, and it could be revisited in the future and adjusted on that. So I'm sorry, I'd like to see the full 2,000.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor for 1,000. Do I hear? No, I won't go there. Let's vote on that motion. All those in favor of the $1,000. Opposed? Okay, so we will revise it. That's passed. We will revise it if and when the time mandates it, and I'm sure that staff will do reports in the future about what that's costing us. Okay, the last one. All cannabis businesses will be required to pay a provincial referral fee in the amount of, Mrs. Kaler, please, before we get into motions.
So the background on this one, we do have currently in our procedure bylaw a $500 council referral fee, and we use that for liquor license applications. So council may recall when Mount Arrowsmith Brewing came to amend its license recently, they paid a $500 fee that covers our costs for advertising and staff time for preparing the report to council, and then we also, of course, have to forward that to the liquor branch. And so that's kind of our starting point, and staff would be recommending a similar process for these types of referrals, and that would basically be accompanied by a policy that staff would bring to council that would outline the criteria for considering, you know, proximity or other things that council would like to evaluate the application on, and then outlining how council would gather public comment, and the fee would cover those activities, and the person would apply to the city when they apply for their license to the province. So
the amount again?
The current amount is $500 for liquor license applications.
Anybody want to move $500? Councillor Burton, seconded by Councillor Powell. Discussion on the $500. Councillor B.
Thank you, Your Worship. A question through to Mrs. Kaler, if I may. I'm just wondering, given that that $500, for instance, was a fee and that was applied probably last year, or maybe it was earlier this year, have costs not gone up since then at all? I'm just curious. I mean, wages go up, other costs go up. So if they have gone up, I'm just wondering if we should consider increasing that amount at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Councillor Beale. I would say that $500 for the liquor license probably does not cover the full cost recovery of that. It is a fair bit of work, and we do notice to a number of people within a certain distance, and so depending on how controversial it is, it can be a lot of staff time. But other times it's very straightforward, so it's really up to council.
With that information, I'd like to make an amendment and change that amount to $750 for a referral fee.
Amendment to 750. Do I hear? No, I won't go there. Okay. I'm going to call the question. On the amendment, $750. All those in favor? Opposed? That is carried. Okay, so now on the motion as amended. All those in favor? Oh, I'm sorry. You want to speak to it? Go ahead.
I've been wanting for a while. I just want to say one thing, and I think this was great that Councillor Beale just raised that. I think that going forward, this is just the beginning anyways. It's a cash cow, and we're going to get all we can out of it. We're doing that now, and we're just starting. I can't help but think that this will turn into what every other, cigarettes, liquor, etc., and it's going to be a money-making product. And the only worry that I have is that at this point it's not legal, and no one's paying all these fees because they're just growing it in their backyard or wherever. So I think we want to be a little bit circumspect because there's nothing to stop them from doing that, carrying on doing that. So it's interesting to me that we're pretty all over that, but I'm not sure how well that's going to play out if we're not careful with what we're doing here with the costs.
Okay, on that note, Councillor Oates.
Yes, I agree that, it's early stages, but doing nothing was not an option, and maybe this falls short. Maybe somebody looks back afterwards and say you did it all wrong. But and that's my point. This staff will now prepare some bylaw amendments and policy documents. It'll come back to this council and it'll come back to the other council before it ever gets finalized. So there's lots of opportunities, I guess, to adjust all of these numbers. For me, my interest tonight was to have some clear regime set out so people that wanted to get into the business here, they knew exactly what they were faced with. with respect to the city's restrictions and the things they needed to conform with. So I'd like to say thank you to staff, especially for this. This is an enormous amount of work, and I think that what we've done here can stand up against anything else in the province.
Okay. Councillor Burton?
Well, I don't know. I hope not. I'd like to add one more piece. I'd like to add a prohibition in our community parks, in our playgrounds, coming later. What did I miss?
I want to call the vote on the $750 for a provincial referral fee. All those in favor? Opposed? And, you know, there's no doubt in my mind that this is the beginning. I mean, I would imagine as time goes by, there'll be a lot of changes, a lot more feedback, and staff will have a chance to assess it. So, Councillor Burton, what were you talking about before I close this discussion?
No idea. I would like to see a motion to restrict the use of cannabis in public places.
Mrs. Kaler, I thought have we covered that?
So, Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Burton, I think I would need a little bit more direction as to what you would like to see, but the provincial regulation, so there's a bill called Bill 30, which is the regulation or statute that controls cannabis. It does contain a number of prohibitions on the public smoking or vaping of cannabis, which includes public parks, schools, workplaces, bus shelters, no, not sidewalks. So what we had discussed in our committee was the challenge with enforcement. We tried to get some clear information from the province on numerous occasions as to how they will be enforcing this requirement. We did mention that there's some challenges with some of the other enforcement in our community, specifically with the wildlife management area. And we were told that there would be regulations coming forth in the fall. I did check as of yesterday, they aren't there yet. That will spell out enforcement resources provincially and how they will be enforcing that kind of thing. I also asked whether the police will be able to enforce just like they can with open liquor, for example. And I was told that they are setting up a special crime unit at the provincial government, but they couldn't give me any more information at this point on that. So I guess on that one, it's kind of a wait and see. Sorry, we don't have anything more concrete, but we're just not sure what kind of enforcement the provincial government will be able to provide on that front. And it would be very difficult for us to enforce with our current resources, but we will take direction.
Well, I think having something out there will deal with the people that want some guidance as to where they can smoke. There will always be people that don't really care, but I'd like to see that we put some guidance in place for people that are wondering. So I would like to make a motion that we don't allow the consumption of, we don't allow smoking cannabis. And let's make, because that's the issue for me. It's not necessarily the use of, it's the smells and the smoke and those sorts of things that go along with it. So it's, I'd like to see us prohibit smoking cannabis in public places in Parksville.
Smoking of cannabis in public places. Have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Oates. Discussion. Councillor Oates.
Well, I think, you know, it's better to have it there, not being able to enforce it, to not have it there at all. So.
Okay. Councillor Beale.
I would actually really like to support this, and I may support this, but I still do come back then to the question about if people are living in a strata. I mean, it might be a little different in apartments. If you've got an apartment, maybe they've got a bench down in the end of their parking lot, and that's technically on the property, but not in the building, and maybe it's a place where people can have a smoke. But what about strata? If the strata decides there's no cannabis smoking or vaping, and it's something that's legal, what options do people have other than making friends with people who have a house and they can go in their yard or something like that? I don't know.
Councillor Burton and then Councillor Salter.
So stratas have the ability to make those types of rulings now, as do landlords, and that's not public property, that's private property. So I don't think that it has any impact on that.
Councillor Salter.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think common sense would prevail, and whoever is dealing with that would use their common sense in that whatever individual or specific regard is going on at the time.
Okay, we're going to call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you, that is carried. So we say goodbye for now to cannabis and cannabis regulations, and I think that there'll be much more to say about it by future councils, and much more changes to come. All right, I'm going to go to the number three item on your agenda tonight, Council. And before I ask Mrs. Lovegrove for the background, I need a mover and a seconder for the two recommendations. Moved by Councillor Beale, seconded by Councillor Patterson. Mrs. Lovegrove, would you please give us the background on the issue of reports, the 2018 to 2022 financial plan and the amendment thereto?
Thank you, Your Worship. In front of you, you have the report for the 2018 to 2022 amended financial plan. This report brings forward the items that have been brought to Council or budget transfers from one area to another that have come into play since the final financial plan was adopted in May 7th. So we're bringing this forward to Council for information and asking Council to please approve this amended budget so that we are in compliance with provincial legislation. Thank you.
Any questions for Mrs. Lovegrove? Councillor Salter.
Really a question. It's just, and I did look at this earlier. Although I do support, the amendments that we made to our plan over the year, I don't support the current, the recent change that we're amending with regard to the wages. So that's where I can't support this because it's all rolled into one.
Any further questions for Mrs. Lovegrove or any comments? Seeing none, I'm going to call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. That is carried. Okay, Council, we're moving into pursuant to Section 91.1 of the Community Charter, Council proceed to a closed meeting to consider an item relating to receipt of advice subject to solicitor-client privilege. We'll take a 5-minute break. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot something. Ooh. Okay. My page is stuck, that's why. Okay, we need the 5-year financial plan amendment bylaw 2018 to 2022, number 1544.1. I need a mover and a seconder for the recommendation that it be read 3 times. Moved by Councillor Beale, seconded by Councillor Powell. All those in favor? Opposed? Okay, that's 1 opposed. Everybody else is in favor. So